click on that button at the bottom on the Zoom toolbar to get the live transcript as well.
So yeah, we've got everything going there, hopefully. And again, we have got everyone muted at the moment as well to stop any feedback. But again, we can unmute and open up chat at the end for any questions as well. So once again, thank you for joining us this evening. This is a big title, Disability and Technology, Past, Present and Possibilities. That's a lot. So I just want to kick off with a slight step back about what we're talking about this evening and what we mean by some of this. So in terms of disability, I've gone back to our old friends, the Equality Act of 2010, because I think that's a fairly useful definition really about the physical or mental impairment with a substantial or long-term effect on your ability to do normal activities. So that's what we, the standard British definition of disability in legal terms. Technology here is the harder one to define. At the broadest definition, we're sort of talking about constructed means to provide a solution to an issue. And this evening, we're looking at physical and digital technologies, which is perhaps the more traditional end of technologies. We work with a lot of digital technology. We do a lot of IT support. This is what we do. So that's naturally how we're coming at this. This is not ignoring the fact that biotechnology has become a huge thing. It's an emerging discipline, really, in terms of the grand scheme of things. There are some really exciting possibilities around things like gene therapy, but there are also some major implications about genetic conditions. There's some big debates, there's some big ethical debates. For the purpose of this evening, we're looking at the more traditional technology. And essentially, if this were being covered by a traditional media organisation, the topics we're talking about would be covered by your technology correspondent, not your scientific or medical correspondent. That isn't a very specific way of doing this, but it is that kind of more traditional idea of what technology is. So essentially more mechanical and digital options this evening, simply just because the topics are too big. Which brings us to assistive technology. What even is it?
Yeah, now I wouldn't class myself as having a disability, but I would class myself as making use of a lot of assistive technology. Assistive technology goes beyond disability. Now, all three of us presenting today actually wear quite a ubiquitous piece of assistive technology, and that is these glasses things that stick on our eyes and let us be able to see things in a lot more clarity than I otherwise would. And actually, these things are really quite special. And to be honest, I can't see an awful lot without having these on. A bit like the guy at the end of Time Enough at Last when he breaks his glasses in the Twilight Zone. And actually, this technology is technology that has been with us for a very long time, a really long time. In fact, I've got some pictures here of glasses being used in the 15th century, medieval glasses. And actually, eyewear like this, it goes back even before that. And before that too, we had other ways of being able to enhance our vision, little pebbles and things and little lenses. And so we end up being able to balance these things on our noses with these scissor glasses that we had in the Middle Ages. And eventually we learn that we can stick arms on them and stick them to our head by hooking them over our ears and stuff. And they're brilliant. They're brilliant. And they have kind of changed our lives in massive, important ways, because like I say, I can see things now and read the slide and stuff like that. Glasses are absolutely brilliant. And the design, as you saw just then, is not really changed an awful lot in hundreds of years, because if it's not broken, why would you fix it? So yeah, glasses, amazing things. And also, they are things that we've kind of got so used to now that we don't even really think of them. They are ubiquitous. And that is partly because they are really affordable now as well, particularly certainly in the Western world that we're living in right now. We have got a lot of access to these things. They are cheap. They may be subsidized by things like the NHS. And like I say, all three of us presenting are wearing them right now. You don't really blink when you see them. They are absolutely accepted parts of society that we're all really, really used to. In fact, they're so useful as tools, that we can employ them in other ways as well. So we can tint the glass in them, and suddenly we've got sunglasses. We're protected from the sun's rays. We can actually see during summer. We can stick different colored lenses in them and see 3D from a 2D object. We can even use the kind of frames of glasses and the basic design principle of glasses and stick a kind of little head-up display on them and start using them as augmented technology like Google Glass, where you're able to use the principle of glasses to actually start winking at something and accessing the internet or things like that, doing all sorts of exciting things using a pair of glasses. Glasses have become cool, glasses have become a fashion accessory, but glasses are also, we've become cyber in a way. These are these augmented technologies that we're adding to our bodies, are giving us this kind of Cyberman approach of being able to explore and enhance our world and enhance our abilities and take on new powers and see things. It's brilliant. Glasses are cool, aren't they?
Glasses are great, and they are one of very many technologies. So the next few slides are going to look at some bits of assistive technology. Now, these are relatively late in the grand scheme of assistive technologies. These are from the late 19th century onwards. But as Steph has shown with the glasses go back at least 500 years and longer, really. Recognisable glasses about 500 years or so. But in terms of assistive tech, there are feeding bottles for babies with cleft palates that go back to Anglo-Saxon times, or pottery feeding bottles to cope with sort of differences in terms of tongue tie and so on. There are walking canes in Egyptian tombs. People have been using different forms of assistive tech and interventions for disability for a really, really long time. So these are a few sort of, I'd say, more recent in the grand scheme examples. These are all from the Science Museum medical collections. And they just bring up a few points about some of the key trends and changes that we get. So this first one is a bath chair. And bath chairs take their name from the city of Bath, which in turn takes its name from baths, because it has a hot spa there. So spa towns are often used historically as places to send invalids to take the waters and so on. And therefore chairs for people who were unwell, who had disabilities, are very common at these resorts. And this is the kind of chair that starts being used. And it's a big wickerwork chair. These are used really from the 18th century onwards, but this example is from the early 19th century. They remain in use for a long time at that kind of a resort. You can see we've got metal wheels there. No real padding, that's not going to be comfortable, especially on a cold street, but there we go. The user can theoretically steer that a bit, but one thing that is critical about this that you can see what we've got here is this handle at the back. Someone's got to push that. You need an attendant. So you've got to have a carer, or quite often a servant, or somebody who worked at the spa if this was at a resort, is going to push that chair for you. So you've got to have somebody there. It's also, this is designed for use in kind of hotels and things, and you do get wealthier people in stately homes having this kind of thing as well. But this is big. That's got a big turning circle. That's not going to fit in most people's homes. So there is a kind of class issue, an issue about cost and care, which is still an issue today with kind of technological interventions for disability. This is a bit more recognisable probably as a kind of early wheelchair. It's quite an elegant bit of furniture, and that kind of is what it is. It is furniture, it's adapted furniture, but it is basically a bent wooden cane chair. Not obvious materials in one sense, but they're nice and light. And a key point about this one, and it is unusual about kind of 19th century ones in this way, is trying to get them more and more about the individual, that there's giving agency to the disabled individual using the technology. So here you can see that we've got these rim sections put onto the wheels. Again, no padding on those wheels. Again, that's going to be quite uncomfortable. There's no tyres here. The development of bicycles is quite helpful for the wheelchair in that sense, as we start to get vulcanized rubber and so on getting involved. But the fact we have this handle on the wheel to turn, that's essentially the same mechanism that's still used in manual wheelchairs today. How practical this is? Well, they've got quite large arms on the chair, the placement of the wheels, I'm not sure they've entirely thought that through, and we don't have a foot plate. So depending on the user, this may or may not be a particularly helpful chair, but this idea that agency is given to the user is really important, that they can have somebody push them, or theoretically they could propel themselves. This one is self-propelling, quite an unusual design. This doesn't really go anywhere massively during the 20th century, but it's experimenting with the ideas of, again, agency. So we've got a more padded chair, more comfortable for the user, hopefully. We have got self-propulsion. We do not have handles for this to be pushed. This is something that somebody can use their arms to propel. Theoretically, this was supposed to be easier than turning the wheels, but it never really took off. So I do question that. But it's an interesting one. We've got a foot plate there. There's much more attention has been given to this. Something about this that is interesting, though, is the fact that it does look like a medical device. There's no kind of, oh, is this an elegant piece of furniture question here? That's a medical device. And it's an interesting thing as you look at assistive tech and whether it's kind of blends in as part of society or whether it's actually very obviously an intervention for something. So this is an interesting one because they are trying to look more at user agency, but they haven't really worried about aesthetics at all. And then this one, which I think looks like something from tomorrow's world. It's amazing. So these are first produced from 1972, designed by Lord Snowdon for a friend of his who required use of electric wheelchair. Again, in quite large homes. These are in wealthy people's homes. So again, this is quite compact, but it is for indoor use. Not necessarily going to work in every home. Again, wheelchair accessible housing is still a real problem today, so that's not new. But we've got a foot plate here, we've got a padded chair. The controls on this one are mounted to the left, but it can be mounted left or right. So it's very much adapting to the user. This one's really interesting because it is also produced in conjunction with the NHS. This model is the basis of the NHS one. But again, the cost of these things, because this is provided by the NHS, but can't really be used outside. We've got tiny wheels, it's for indoor use. So we've got a solution for moving around in indoor spaces, but not necessarily outdoor spaces. So kind of very brief whistle-top tour of wheelchairs there. And prosthetic limbs, so this is quite a late one, but in terms of the technology, they don't really change for a really long time. So this is from 1894, again, Science Museum Medical Collections. And this is a big wooden leg, basically, and it is created for a 16-year-old soldier. But one of the things about a decently made wooden limb is it can last a really long time. And the man who owned this had it for 60 years. So it's potentially costly. It has to be made for the individual, and it has to be made by a skilled craftsman. If it's a decent one, this one is nicely turned and shaped, but it can last. It can be a really durable solution. Limited mobility on that. You've got a couple of joints there. And also it's going to be really heavy. So not ideal, but mechanized warfare changes that massively. And many of the advances we've seen around medicine, particularly for people who suffered amputation, really developed from the First and Second World War. Similarly, things around plastic surgery, chemical burns, these things, again, it's from mechanized warfare. So this example, we can see a cast being taken from a young man who's being fitted for an artificial limb at Roehampton. And they start specialising in support for amputees from 1915 and are still known for it. And they're really interesting because they start acknowledging the need for physical therapy to help people adjust to prostheses. But also, again, kind of trying to fit them specifically to people as well. First World War starts seeing a lot of use of aluminium as a very durable material, but also one that's much lighter for use of artificial limbs, which then carries on through the Second World War. And so this is a Ministry of Information photograph. This is from the Imperial War Museum. And this is Mr. Phillips at work, and he is using his own artificial limb to make another. And you do see these schemes. It's very much focused on servicemen, but the rehabilitation of servicemen and the development of these technologies sees these then applied in other spheres. So they kind of develop. Again, not really worrying too much about the aesthetics on these. But this changes through the 20th century. And again, the cost of things changing as well. So the idea that those early glasses are really expensive because lenses and glasses are expensive, through to the fact that you can get NHS ones, you can get relatively cheap glasses, you can buy reading glasses in pound shops and things. So limbs, different, obviously needs to be tailored in a very different way, but the way we approach this is different. And in terms of digital technology, the fact you can scan Digital scans are amazing. So they're not having to take a plaster cast anymore. It's a completely different way of doing it. But also, it opens up the possibility of designing and producing in different places. So you can link design teams with people who can 3D print. And 3D printing has been really exciting around a lot of prostheses because it just brings the cost down massively and allows for individualized things to be produced. It's particularly exciting in terms of prostheses for children, because obviously children with limb difference, as they grow, will need different limbs creating. But the cost of doing that, if you're having one-off things made, can be extortionate. And particularly if they live in a country that doesn't have socialised healthcare or their insurance plans don't cover it and so on. So this kind of project is really exciting. It's also an interesting thing because you do get charitable trusts and companies set up specifically for this. So this one is Team Unlimited. But it's a nice example of something that's been made specifically for a child. So a growing child has got something that fits them and fits them specifically and can be replaced at a lower cost than otherwise would have been possible. But these are all quite visible things, and a lot of assistive technology isn't. So we've gone from glasses, which we kind of see and don't see, help us see, but an awful lot of the things that we work with in terms of our jobs will have assistive technology. Now, that might be an ergonomic keyboard or a mouse setup or something to help with the digital tech. But we also work with a lot of things around screen reading technology, around voice recognition technologies. And again, these feel quite modern. And Siobhan's gone into darkness. It happened. Here we go. And the lights are back on. There we go. But that's an automated bit of technology as well. We have motion sensor lights for green purposes, which then plunge people into darkness if they haven't moved. Possibly it is an assistive technology to stop everybody getting deep vein thrombosis by making us move regularly. I don't know. But a lot of these technologies have actually existed for a long time. So with voice technology, one of the earliest kind of mechanical versions that we can really recognize as a speech synthesizer is called Euphonia. And she is a terrifying mannequin who was created in the mid-19th century. And she can be controlled very carefully to produce the right lip shapes and mouth shapes, and then kind of have air pushed through this kind of mechanical head to make vocal noises. But as soon as you start getting electronic and digital options, they start to come in. So as soon as we start having recording devices, it starts to go in. Within 2 years of creating his phonograph, Edison is working on a dictaphone. In the 1930s, they're working on a thing called a Voda, which is a voice recognition thing. It's premiered at the World Fair in 1939 when it's patented in 1939. By 1962, IBM have Shoebox, which is a voice recognition bit of computer software, can do 16 words. We get to Dragon. Dragon is one of the bits of technology we use quite frequently when we're working with people who need to be able to dictate to machines. They need to be able to dictate to a computer. Dragon's first bit of commercial software for consumers, 1990. It's been around a while, but even more than that, it gets everywhere in society. So Siri dates from 2011, 10 years old. And we've got Cortana and Alexa from 2014. Again, they're not specifically assistive technologies, but they come from the same place and they all have different roles. So these are all potential assistive technologies which can be used in very different ways. But the point is about this, it's not just assistive tech. Disabled people are everywhere. We are everywhere in society and we are using all the same technology in society that everybody else is as well. So you have disabled gamers, you have people shopping online, you have people on social media, you have people taking selfies. Disabled people are using all of the normal technology that anyone might expect to use, plus potentially assistive solutions as well, because technology is everywhere.
Yeah, let's think about this sort of technology being absolutely everywhere. One of the most ubiquitous forms of technology that we use in our modern world is the internet, particularly the World Wide Web, which we've been playing around with since the 1990s. And I thought that it might be useful for us to explore how the World Wide Web has been a kind of assistive experience and kind of been a kind of interesting experience as a kind of experiment in terms of how we understand how people use things like the internet. So I thought I'd do that through the lens of the University of York's own web pages. what I've got here is the 1994 version of the University of York web pages. Actually, the one on the left, the green one there, is a little bit later, but it's basically the same page. And this is from a time in the mid-90s where people's computers could be any old thing. It could be a very graphical, modern PC, or it could be something like a Unix terminal that would just be a lot of text. And so you would have things like text browsers. The thing on the right-hand side is the same website, but viewed through this particular case, the Lynx text browser. So this was just text, no images. So the little masthead that we've got on the left-hand side with the kind of woodcut graphics at the top, you can't see that on a text-only terminal. And even the shape and size of a web page, you had no way of knowing. And so you had to just make web content that would work for everybody. You would try and work out good ways in which you could shortcut processes like understanding an image, because if people can't see images, they need that information to come through. And so people would write with these things in mind, and you would have web pages that were very flexible and could work in any situation. But then as the decade wore on, as we got to the late 90s, it was much more standard in the ways that people were accessing the internet. And more people were accessing the internet with new PCs and with similar sized monitors and very graphical browsers that they could access the internet with. And so you start to get things like this version of the University of York's website. Back in 1997, this one was launched, and it's using an image map, which is very fixed. It's always going to be a uniform size, regardless of the size of your monitor. If you look at this version of the website now, it's tiny compared to our huge monitors. And it's using tables, which aren't actually very friendly things to use if you're trying to replicate this page in some other way. But this page was still being made by the same people that were making the website before. And so what we have down in the bottom left-hand corner here is we've got a link to an alternate version, a text version of the website, because there's still this understanding that not everybody is going to be seeing the website through a nice graphical browser. And that means that that's got a lot of advantages. Not only could anybody be accessing this page through different means, but also the thing about text is that we can have it read to us. We can understand that text in lots of different ways. It's easily manipulable. So this actually, strangely, was kind of an accessible site in a way, because there's an alternate version. But then as the decades wear on, we move into the next millennium, we move into the 21st century. And what we have is a kind of new approach to making websites. So before everything had to be styled individually, suddenly we're styling things from a separate bit of information. A separate document starts to come in to style things. Now that too is useful. That allows me as a user of a web page to use things in my browser to change those styles. So it could be that I could press F12 on a modern browser these days, access the underlying code of the web page, and make global changes to the appearance of that web page. So this web page here from 2002 is very white, green text on green background, not necessarily ideal, but I could go into the underlying style sheet for this page and change those colors and have a different view of this web page. But then we start to forget some of this. And so this page here is very tabular. It's very hard to navigate if you aren't in the right browser settings. And by this point as well, we've lost that text-only version that we'd had before. So we're starting to see something that's a lot less friendly and a lot less customizable. This version, actually, I've only left this one quite small because there's not a lot to see, because most of it's broken now. Because a lot of the kind of weird and wonderful carousels are just really horrible and don't work if you've not got all the bits and bobs that are required to get it to work. You get that a lot with a lot of old websites. Now, fortunately, by the time you get to the current version of the website, which launched in 2016, things are a lot nicer again. There's a lot more going into it to try and make it a lot better in terms of what we would call responsive design. So, for instance, I might be looking at a web page on a computer. I might be looking at a web page on a mobile phone. And so that requires a very different kind of layout. A mobile phone is usually viewed in portrait, whereas most of our monitors are kind of landscape for a PC. And also, if you start to think responsively in terms of how you design a page and how that page might lay itself out in different formats, but you can also then start to think in terms of accessibility as well, and start to build in processes behind the scenes that make this page look better, regardless of what you're using, regardless of the technology that you're using, but also in how you're reading that page, if you're using a screen reader or something like that. Now, all of this does actually make it much harder for us to write web pages. So it was very easy to write a web page back when the University of York first created its website in 1994. Anybody could have done it, very basic scripts. But as we get on, it's not just the web code, which is a tiny little bit here, but you've also got all sorts of styles and scripts and complicated bits and bobs that are creating this web page. It makes it much harder for us to actually communicate online in a useful and accessible and customizable way.
So what kind of things can we actually do in terms of design then, to design with all these sorts of things in mind? Like, how can we get back to that idea of different versions and ways that people can access it in different ways, whilst also still, you know, trying to design for the modern world? Well, we're going to bring in the concept now of something called universal design. And universal design is where, instead of trying to design with, say, one particular need in mind or a particular thing, the aim is to try and design for as many people as possible with whatever you're doing. So it's quite a broad term because it's universal, maybe, and it's quite a general thing. But there's a few key elements we can think about. So we can think about it in terms of making better experiences, accessing something, any kind of technology, for everyone. So thinking about that, there's lots of different reasons why people need things to be designed well. As Steph was saying, sometimes you're accessing a website on different kinds of devices. So if you design universally with universal design in mind, you'll be ready for whether or not somebody is accessing it on a laptop or a desktop computer on a larger screen, or on a tablet or a mobile phone. They could be accessing it on a television, which is maybe even a different size or shape. They might be accessing it using a screen reader. It might be that they're getting a voice assistant to read aloud some search results to them. So that's a very different way of accessing content. So we can try and make better experiences for everyone by trying to design in certain elements, which we'll come to in a moment. It's really focused on user experience. So it's not about trying to make the website how you think it should be necessarily. It's about making it an experience that's right for somebody. Thinking about different kinds of user requirements is very important. And that is a really key in universal design. So a lot of it is doing research into what users might need for what you're doing, getting people to try out using the website, for example, in lots of different ways, or using the technology in different ways and seeing what people might need. And then the other thing that's kind of important to bring up, and I'll return to in a moment, is thinking about how it might reduce bias against particular groups of people. So the bias can be encoded into technologies. Technologies that don't work for particular groups of people can lock them out of using certain things, or not able to them to do certain things. And so we can start to use some of these principles to help us and think about this. So if we move on to looking at our sort of inclusive design principles, we can sort of start to see the practicalities of this. So those are nice ideas, aren't they? That sort of user experience and having better experiences and all this sort of thing. But what do we actually do? Well, the first thing we can think about is giving people comparable experiences. So what that means is, it doesn't mean exactly the same, because people don't want that even. Most people want to be able to have content in a format that suits them, suits their needs. But comparable means giving people the information they need, the relevant content, in ways that means that they're not missing out. Particular groups of people aren't missing out. So a really simple example of this is sometimes when you go onto the mobile version of a website, loads of things don't work on it because they weren't designed for phones. This is slightly less true these days. As Steph said, responsive web has kind of come on quite far. But there was a whole point when you couldn't basically view any videos on a mobile phone, especially on an iPhone, because they just hadn't built in the technology in a mobile phone to make that work. And so there wasn't really, unless you'd included, say, a transcript of what was in the video or a very extended description of the content, you weren't getting a comparable experience. In the same way, if you're putting images onto pages or images into technology, someone who cannot see those images needs to know what content they're missing if it's important, especially if it's something like a graph or a diagram. There could be a lot of stuff they're missing out, content they're not getting. So that's really important. Another principle is to think about situation. So the different situations people are going to be in to access this technology, to be using it. It's quite interesting because there's lots of different situations, and they can be something that's more permanent, they can be temporary, they can fluctuate. People can have different needs at different points. So inclusive design takes into account that people might not always need the same thing. Sometimes you might need different things. You know, if I was trying to read a page with my glasses on, I could read it with a small font and be fine. If I was trying to read something without my glasses on, I would not be able to read it unless the font was huge. Especially because I'm long-sighted, so anything that's near me can't see it. So you've got to think that there's lots of different situations. People don't always have exactly the same needs. So inclusive design has to take into account that sort of thing. Another really useful thing to think about, and this is particularly true, I'd say, of web pages and apps and stuff, but it's true across a lot of technology, is consistency. So there's nothing more confusing than when you're using technology and it's in different places. It's not where you expect, especially within a certain area. So you're on a website and you on one page, certain buttons are somewhere, and you go to another page and the same buttons are in different places, or the design has changed quite drastically. That's not useful. It's not really inclusive. It's not going to give people the experience they expect. The next two I like to kind of link together, sort of giving control and offering choice. So one thing that's really important is this idea of user choice, users being able to decide what features or ways they need to access particular content and materials. This is built into a lot of modern technology. I'll mention it again in a moment, but there's loads of stuff where we can now choose how we view and access content, you know, whether we hear it, whether we see it, whether it appears in different ways. And that's a really useful thing to think about, is that these technologies need to give people this kind of control and choice over what they can do. They can, as Steph was saying, perhaps change the fonts if they need to. They can, you know, change the tints on the screen or something. They can make sure that the background suits what they can see. All sorts of things like that. Prioritizing the content is also really important. Like we love design. I mean, lovely designed websites, designed things. Our slides, we designed those, we put pictures on them. But also what's really important is the content. That's what people are probably come for. So making sure that what's important content is prioritized is really inclusive and important there, and just giving that kind of value. So if we have a look at some of these choice options here, we can see, I've just taken some screenshots from my own device here. So the first one we've got is the accessibility options. This is on a Mac, that's what I use. But there's loads of different things built into most technologies you'll have, whether you've got a laptop or you've got a phone or a tablet maybe, or whatever you use, wherever you manage to use it. There's different features built into these that are really useful for giving that choice, whether it's, you know, being able to change things like the display or the font size, whether it's being able to change whether or not content is read aloud to you, or you can use voice controls to talk to it. There's all sorts of different things that are built into devices that offer that choice now. One really simple one is the fact that you can turn on dark mode in an awful lot of devices now, which can be useful for all sorts of reasons, whether you want to just look like a hacker, or whether you find it easy on the eyes. Maybe your eyes are sensitive to light and it's much easier to see something if it's got dark mode and there's a lot less light coming out of your devices. So there's lots of different things like that you can do. The other thing I've got on the slide is an example of a video, a YouTube video, in fact one I made, that's got captions. And captions have, you know, become a really important thing within technology. You could turn on the live transcript for us as we're talking right now, because for some people that is maybe the only way they can access that content. Maybe it's their preferred way. As somebody who hates watching videos, I love having captions or a transcript, or preferably both, so I can choose which one I want to do at that point. It also can be situational. Maybe someone's in a really loud place and that's the only way they can access the content at that moment. It's universal because lots of different people for different reasons might want to either hear or see the content depending on what they're doing. So that's really important. And then if we move on, the last thing I want to talk about at this point is about this bias idea I was thinking about. So there's a few different kinds of bias, and by thinking about it, it helps us to see where technologies are helpful and sometimes where technologies need to do better, where we can perhaps influence, we can, you know, give feedback, or if we're making, say, a website or a document, we can think about some of these things. So one kind of bias that we can think about is data set bias. So that's when you've got data that's only representative of a particular kind of group and perhaps lacking certain diversity. Now that could be true if someone created a website that wasn't accessible and then asked for feedback on it. If nobody with particular access needs is able to give feedback on the website, their data will not have any feedback about the lack of accessibility on the website. So things like that can cause these sorts of weird problems where you've got this bias on this website that's caused by the website in some ways. There's different things like that. There's different kinds of systems that have association bias, so reinforcing particular bias and stereotypes and things like that. Sometimes not using universal design can do that in ways. It can sort of most stigmatize needing to have a more accessible version, which is not what we want. So you can think about the sorts of associations that are made with different things. Another interesting kind of bias, I think, is automation bias, which is this kind of bias that we perhaps have towards the idea that computers, automated decisions, are better than other kinds of decisions or considerations, so better than, say, social or cultural ideas. Lots of people say, well, computers can't be wrong. Computers have got it right. But that's often not true. I mean, so we saw the data could be wrong, or maybe it was made, all the programmers were a particular demographic and they didn't think of any of the experiences. They didn't do any user research. They didn't do anything like that. And then we can have some real issues. I mean, you can see that with things like voice assistants, which often you can find out about having issues like that, where like it's just not been taken into account particular issues and particular real life experiences of people. Another one, this going away from computers, is where humans can actually cause bias. They can tamper with AI. They can create biased results. There's all sorts of things you could do there. You could keep asking something that's powered by AI, like a voice assistant, this sort of artificial intelligence, questions and getting it to give wrong answers or something until that's what it thinks it should be doing. So people using things in the wrong way can sometimes do stuff, whether it's on purpose or not. And the final kind of bias we can think about is confirmation bias. So that's basically where you have preconceptions, and so you simplify your ideas, and then you don't move on from that. You just go with it. And that's really easy to do with you when you're trying to design things like this, when you're trying to design for users. So it's really easy to think, well, I think that, this website is definitely accessible because I think this kind of person is going to access it this way, and that's it. And so that it's fine. I don't think this person would actually want to use this content. You might think, oh, I don't think somebody who, had this access need would want to access this content, so I'm not going to make it accessible, for example. And that is this kind of bias. And so by thinking about these sorts of biases that people might have and the things in the design, we can start to push for them to be designed better, because technology is changing and there's been lots of positive changes recently. But we've got to kind of, push for those things to improve and look for ways that we think they could be improved to help. I'll hand over to Alice to look at that.
So I'm just remembering to unmute myself there, because that is one of the things that we have learned from the use of technology through the past 18 months or so. And it's difficult to talk about the pandemic really, because it has been a mass trauma, and it has been immensely difficult for many disabled people. It's disproportionately impacted many disabled people living in group care settings, people with any kind of immunocompromise or higher vulnerability. Many people who rely on lip reading have struggled immensely with masks. There have been huge problems around COVID and disability. But in terms of technology and accessibility, and specifically around digital accessibility, there have actually been some really positive things. And one of those is more use of tools and using the mic. And historically, there's always been a problem at a conference that somebody will have done theatre at school and think that they can project to the back of the hall and not use the mic. No, use the microphone. Use the microphone. There will be people who are hard of hearing, people maybe having to use hearing loops and so on. Use the mic. When we're on Zoom, we're having to use the mic. The computer can't hear me unless I'm using the mic. So forcing people into actually doing some things that are maybe a bit more inclusive anyway. Having events online for a start overcomes quite a lot of geographical and financial issues as well. So the fact that we can have things online and use the tools online is in itself a positive change. And the development of these tools. So at the start of the pandemic, there was a bit of a rush. We brought in Zoom. It was very unfamiliar to us at the time. It is now one of our best friends, obviously. But things like the live transcripts, they were there, but they weren't necessarily very good. They're still not perfect, not by a long way, but they have improved immensely through the course of the pandemic because people were using them. The demand was there, and people had an interest in making their events accessible online and making them work. And so video platforms have to start including things like a live transcription option, and they have to start making these better. So it's actually seen the development and widespread adoption of a lot of things like live transcript, which hadn't really been used much or really explored fully before. And again, that more being made available online, being able to work remotely. some of these things are massive in terms of life experience for disabled people. So we have a picture here of a cat having a lovely time meeting up with cat friends online in a Zoom meeting. But the fact that in both work and leisure, more things are available online, and whether that's being able to go to a conference that you couldn't have managed either financially, or you wouldn't have managed the travel before, being able to work with people around the world, there's lots of quite exciting, accessible possibilities that have come out digitally through the pandemic. And in the sort of big push to get everybody back in the office, I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of some of these quite major developments that have been there. So something positive can actually come out of this. And just again, in terms of that, designing for access, that as people are thinking, actually, is this Zoom meeting inclusive? Have I got a transcript? Am I making people turn on cameras when they don't have bandwidth? That inclusive thinking is great. But again, Siobhan mentioned user testing there in the discussion of bias in design, and it's really important. So accessible design, we need to get better at it. We need to do it more, but we do need user consultation in this always. And this is a brilliant example of it. It looks like an MC Escher drawing, but it is a real place. It is Robson Square in Vancouver. And it is both sort of beloved and hated because, I mean, it looks great. It looks fantastic. It also, to me, as a dyspraxic person, looks terrifying because that looks like a death trap. There's no demarcation on those steps. If I were visually impaired beyond being glasses wearer, I would struggle potentially to see where steps start and where ramps start and things there. We've got very tight corners on those turns. If I've got a pushchair, if I'm on a bicycle, if I'm a wheelchair user, is that a big enough turning circle for me? I don't know. We don't have any sides to these ramps. There's a lot going on there that is a bit worrying. So yeah, I mean, brilliant. They've thought to put ramps in. They don't just want a whole plaza full of steps. They've thought we need ramps. People need ramps. But who did they talk to? Because I would question maybe who they got their advice from on this. So yeah, it looks great, but it's potentially pretty dangerous. So ramps and stairs are kind of a really obvious example of it, but they remain quite an interesting one.
Yeah, and it's not the issue, isn't it? Because I mean, York is very flat. York isn't really a problem in terms of ramp. Well, there are problems, cobbles and things like that. But in terms of hills and stuff, I come from Sheffield. Alice, you come from kind of Bristol way. These are very hilly places, very hilly cities, and actually it can be a real nightmare getting around there if you haven't got legs, or legs that will do the job for you and work and get you up the hills. Now, this is, you know, an example of the fact that steps turn out to be not only beautiful, attractive architectural design features, but they're also incredibly efficient at getting us up hills. Compared to a slope that you could, that's quite, a 1 in 12 slope there, which is kind of the bare minimum in terms of how you could get up a slope. That is not going to get you anywhere near as far as the equivalent space of steps. So steps are like a really important part of our society, of our world. And it'd be nice to have some sort of equipment that would help people get up these steps, even if you can't walk up them. To go back to what Alice was showing us, all those pictures of wheelchairs and things. Well, here's a wheelchair that can get up steps. This is the Scewo BRO, and it's yours for £30,000. And look at it, it's like an armored tank. It's got little caterpillar tracks that can get you up those stairs. Brilliant. And okay, £30,000, that's a lot of money, but just like those spectacles that the people in the Middle Ages were wearing, and they were very kind of premier, sort of high-end use, and not everybody was able to see, but now pretty much anybody can afford a pair of glasses, and it's wonderful, and we can all see. And maybe the people will be able to get into these chairs and use these chairs to get upstairs, or maybe we'll even invent techno trousers, and we can all wear techno trousers to get up inclines of any kind. We don't even need stairs. We could walk straight up walls. It'll be brilliant. Technology can solve any problem. And okay, there's a difference in scale in terms of glasses, because a lot of us wear glasses, not so many of us use wheelchairs, but techno trousers is technologies that we can all use to overcome all sorts of obstacles in our societies, build fantastic world in which we can all traverse any environment we like. Isn't it amazing? It's amazing, Siobhan, isn't it?
But what if I don't want any techno trousers? What if I like ramps? What if technology isn't the answer to everything? What if not everyone wants the technology? That's the thing, isn't it? You know, there's amazing technology out there and there's so many things that we can be using and there's so much accessible technology, but there's also lots of reasons why people might be hesitant to use it or might not want to use it or might not want to use it in certain circumstances, taking into account different situations. There's lots of different reasons for that. I mean, one hesitation I have with techno trousers is I'm a bit worried about the company making it. I don't know much about them. I don't know what they're doing with the data about which walls I'm walking up. What if they know that I'm walking up that wall at this time and I don't want them to know that? If I don't trust the technology company, that's going to potentially impact what I do. And I do trust some technology companies with enough data to do things. You know, I use a mobile phone. We're doing this in Zoom. They're a technology company. In the modern world, you often have to place a bit of trust, whether it's misguided or not, in some technology companies to do things. So we are going to trust some of these companies, but you also want to ask questions about them and check that they're doing. And some people aren't going to want to give, say, lots of health data to an app, for example. There's lots of apps that can do all sorts of clever things now that can help you with your everyday life, with medical things, with assistive technology, but you might not want to give them your data. And another issue is about reliability. So a lot of technology breaks. I mean, we've been, touch wood, relatively lucky so far in this Zoom technology-wise. Mostly my problem has been with lighting. Mostly we've been okay, but technology often is not reliable. And that isn't for the techiest of people, but for everyone, it's not always reliable, and that can cause issues. So we've got things like voice assistants, something like an Alexa, so something where you can talk to and give it commands and it does stuff. And that can make a lot of difference to a lot of people's lives. That can mean that people who can't normally interact with technology in particular ways, or people who find it hard to use screens, they've now got a way to interact with technology. But there's also downsides to them. There's the trusting, do you trust Amazon thing? And, can you accidentally turn it on? And are they recording you when you accidentally turn it on? Things like that. But there's also just the fact of what happens if it goes wrong? What happens if you ask, Alexa to order you a copy of an Only Fools and Horses DVD on Amazon, and it gives you 500 of those DVDs? Unless you're going to go and start up a market stall to sell them all, there's not much use for that. And so there's all sorts of issues where technology might glitch, it might break, it might not be reliable. And do you have the maintenance type? What sort of maintenance costs of fixing the technology? That chair looked amazing. The trousers, the techno trousers look amazing, but what happens if my techno trousers break? How much effort does it take? What if they break when I'm halfway up a wall? Has anyone thought about that? So I think what's really important with technology is to understand reasons people also might not want to use it, and perhaps to think about how it's not just about individuals using technological solutions or technological solutions to everything. It's also about societal changes and thinking more about different kinds of things we'd like in the future.
Which brings us to the kind of idea about future proofing and things, really, because people get very hung up on predicting futures, and you have these super predictors who often aren't particularly super. But whether we need to predict the future or not is maybe not the right question, because we want to think about what we want and where we want to go. And that might not be the same as predicting things. There's a lot of dystopian fiction going around at the moment, which things are pretty dystopian for a lot of people. Maybe we need to imagine where we want to go, what we want to do with things. And as everyone's saying, not everyone's going to want technology. And some of these things are societal levels. Lots of people will benefit from a ramp. Somebody on crutches in a temporary situation will benefit from a ramp. They're not going to want an extremely complicated power chair. But that ramp can be used by lots of people. That's not to say that the extremely complicated power chair sometime in the future doesn't have a possibility, doesn't have a solution to some people. But it's about designing society in a way that has options, those universal design principles, and also talking to people about what they want. Because, the wrong trousers example, yeah, we are being a bit silly with that, but there are kind of weird exoskeleton legs to help people walk again. Now, do people need to walk again if they've lost the use of the legs? If they've never been able to walk, is that something that they actually feel a loss about? Have they talked to people about this? Would they actually like a world where they have an affordable and easily repairable wheelchair in a world with ramps where they can access things? Is that actually better for them than an incredibly complicated pair of wrong trousers? Have they spoken to people? Who has got this data? Again, the issue of data and who has that, medical companies, is a really big one as well, because those apps are exciting and a great way to manage things. But who's got that data? And again, big issue in countries that have insurance as well, the idea that it can be sold on to other companies. So the future that we want to see isn't necessarily the future we're predicting. We need to actually shape it and decide. And we need to design in these options and responding to feedback. That feedback and evaluation is so important, and talking to users. And it sounds such an obvious thing, but even recently, there was a big expo in London of accessible designs, and an accessible activist who is a power wheelchair user could not access the accessible bus because they hadn't designed it for that kind of power chair. And this was in the past few months. People don't talk to disabled users enough, and design should be inclusive. And that's the future that we could have. We don't need to predict what the next big technology is. We just need to make sure that it has options, that it caters for people, that it's inclusive, because the future can be accessible. And technology isn't a universal solution. Technology is neither good nor bad. It's something we use. And it's a thing that's created by humans, whether that's unfortunately a kind of human bias that we've put in, or something that has become almost invisible to lots of people because it's on so many humans. But humans are there with the design and the input, and ultimately the people are important. And the more accessible society doesn't rely entirely on technology, but technology has this potential to help us with problems. And if we design around people and these core values, we can make the future better, and we can make the future more accessible, and we should do. And so that is our potted overview of technology and disability. So I'm going to stop the recording now. And yes, I do want to do that.